And now here is part 2 of the John Musker interview.
They got wind of this thing going on up there, and they called me into the office and they said, "Is this true that you're involved in this project up there, that you're interested in it?" And I said, "Yes." And they were saying, how can we have you? Because I had my own experience on Basil too, where for the first 6 months, since I was the director on it, I did it the way I wanted to do it. So it was kind of a wacky version. It was a little bit more Monty Python. It was kind of the Goon Show.
I remember.
And all that. And Pete Young didn't like it at all. He was just like, "What is he doing? This guy is taking this sweet thing."
But some of that got into it.
Some of it actually stayed in the movie. Some of it did, but
the whole attitude with Basil being wild.
Yeah, that was a carryover, and that was still the kind of John Cleese approach that we wanted to do, and the more manic Basil, which still was based on Holmes. Even now, there's this new series on Holmes with Cumberbatch or whatever his name. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's contemporary.
And it's the Downey stuff.
Yeah, and I like Downey's thing actually. But this other thing is more British but contemporary. But again, he's mercurial. He is. That's really the way Doyle sort of wrote him. It isn't a stretch. So anyway, but we worked on Basil for 6 months. Showed it to Ron, and Joe Ranft was working on it, and it was eccentric. It was quirky. It was a little weird. It wasn't down the mainstream. It went down the middle. And Ron Miller hated it. He just was like, "Start over." He just said, "Start over." So again, I'm like, "I'm out the door. Please, Brad, get this thing going. I'm out the door." So then at some point, I think they heard that I was working on Brad's thing. They're like, "Is this true that you're doing this?" And there were no contracts back in those days. So I said, "Yes, I am interested in doing that, and I'm doing stuff." So then they brought Bernie on to be my co-director. In case I jumped ship, they wouldn't be left high and dry. So I became a co-director with Bernie. So during that period, up until Ron Miller, the big power shift happened, and Michael Eisner came in and all that.
Because I think Bernie had just finished doing Christmas Carol. So,
yeah,
he's a director.
Right. And Bernie needed a home. He was done with Christmas Carol, and so then I was paired up with Bernie, which I didn't really like at the time. I was like, I felt like I.
How did that working relationship evolve? Because it seemed to me that by the end of the film, you guys
No, I worked good by the end. But what happened was, but at that point, I was just like, I just felt like I'm going to back off, and I sort of backed off, and Vance sort of moved forward in a way. Vance put more warmth into the story, and there was more Vance stuff coming, which was good for the movie, I think. And then I was thinking, and I thought, I shaped it the way I wanted to, and now I have to back off and let other people do this and see what they're going to do. So that happened. But when Ron Miller, the Greenmail thing was happening, and Ron Miller was, the studio was under siege by Saul Steinberg, and Ron Miller was the producer of our movie. He was actually like, "I'll produce this one, and I'll take these young people under my wing, and we'll do something fine." But he never showed. Weeks would go by because he was so caught up in all that. He'd come very occasionally. So when the big power shift happened, it was almost like you're in a class. It was like Lord of the Flies or something, but your teacher was killed and nobody knows it. Like the substitute teacher didn't show up, and the students are there without a teacher. I'm like, do we tell anybody we don't have a teacher? Because I don't think the incoming regime even realized that Ron Miller was the producer of that movie. So it's like we were a movie without a producer. So when the regime change happened, which happened when I was on my vacation in Hawaii, I was there with my wife in 1984, and I remember sitting in an airport seeing a headline, "Ron Miller out, Michael Eisner in," and all this stuff. And I just said to my wife, "I wonder if I have a job when I get back," because I thought, wow, this has all changed.
Yeah.
So we came back, so we had to pitch our story, even though we'd been working on it in slow motion for like 3 years. It had never really gotten, Ron Miller was so distracted, it was boarded, and no real drive to get it done.
I remember that whole period.
So we had to pitch
Jeffrey
it.
Had to come
so
in.
Yeah, Jeffrey came in. We pitched it to Michael. We pitched it to Jeffrey. Classic scene, with Jeffrey, where he's again the starched iron shirt, the tie. Michael's running dog. Who is this guy? And so we show him the outline, and we have a sequence in the bar where there's a song that's going to be sung, and Jeffrey's reaction when he looks up. Now, why couldn't we take this number in this barroom thing and say, go to Michael Jackson. Say, "Michael, make this your own." And we're just like, "Mom, we're not in Kansas anymore.
Right. We need a pop star.
Something is different here." And Michael's reaction upon seeing that was like, "Okay, this is great. You got the adventure, you got the comedy. You got to make us cry, okay? If you can make us cry, if you make us laugh and you can make us cry, home run. But you got to make us cry." And you got to do it for a lot less money. You got to do it in half the time.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we had done Young Sherlock Holmes at Paramount, so
yeah. And, well, no, at that point they hadn't, so they were really excited about it. That's why they wanted to do it.
It hadn't come out. So
yeah, it was much later when then it came out and died, and then they're like, okay, this movie that we're doing has nothing to do with Sherlock Holmes. It was like right now with John Carter up Mars, but you know, John Carter. But the name that will not be spoken. It's like Voldemort or something. But so yes, those happy days. So then Michael.
But they greenlit the picture. You know,
they did. It was a crossroads. Even though it'd been working on it that long, it was a kind of thing where they could have killed it. They could have said no.
Hold down the curtain.
And but at that same time, Roy Disney, who was there, said, "We're going to go forward." And Bernie, who was the co-director with me, said, "You are the producer now." Which was a good choice.
Now, was Bernie just a producer at the end? He wasn't the director.
Well, he had been a sequence director. So what ultimately happened was Ron, who went to Bernie and said, I would like to direct. Ron took over Bernie's sequences, and Bernie had brought along Dave Michener as a director. So it became Bernie the producer, who was no longer really directing at all.
Right.
And it was Ron, me, and Dave directing under Bernie. And Bernie was actually a good producer. I think Bernie had definite ideas, but he also delegated and was open to suggestions. So working with Bernie was actually fun. Bernie was very collaborative and didn't try and dictate things, but he had ideas. It wasn't like, and he had some good ideas.
Vincent Price from Champagne for Caesar.
Vincent Price was his idea. Henry Mancini was his idea, and various things. And just his collegial nature worked well with what we were doing. So it was a fun experience working with Bernie. That was I worked with him better, him being the producer rather than us both being directors. Almost it worked better this way in the crazy way. And
really?
He delegated in some ways. It's just and he wasn't very dictatorial, and he liked what we were doing, what Ron was doing, what I was doing. So he didn't come down as too much. Peter Snyder was concerned about production issues, I think, because he was under the gun to make it really cheaply and all that, and if we did anything where too much money was spent, Bernie would get screamed at, and
except they shifted $500,000 from.
Did they?
Bernie told me this just before I got decapitated.
Yeah.
He complained to me one day over at Flower Street. He said, "I'm really pissed." I said, "What?" He said, "We brought this in for $12 million, and they took $500,000 in development from Oliver and Company, and they shifted it over to this picture."
Oh, really? Wow.
They did.
Yeah.
He told me all that.
Okay.
He complained bitterly about it.
Yeah, well, that isn't surprising. The thing always with Jeffrey, it's like when they would nickel and dime us about changes. If there were changes we wanted to make, we would have to fight and beg. But if it was a change Jeffrey wanted, there was always money for that. But anything we wanted to do.
Well, that's a nice underrated picture.
Yeah, I mean, Glenn Keane. So Glenn, who. Again, there were younger people who got a voice in that. Glenn Keane, Matt O'Callahan, us, Pete Young. And it showed in the movie that people were really, putting something into it. And it was a sort of a transitional movie. And Mike Gabriel and Ed Gombert and, yeah, it was good that way.
And then from there, after that picture's done, you and Ron became a team on Little Mermaid.
We did, and that came about because they instituted this Gong Show idea that they had at Paramount to develop ideas.
I remember that, too.
So January of '85, they wanted people to bring 3 ideas around a table, much like this one, and here, give us a pitch. And then, as it turned out, they were running late, so I think they said, just give us your best idea. So Joe Hale did his Black Fantasia, and he had LST for whatever.
That's right, from the Army.
Yeah, from his Marine days at
Pete Young
Okinawa and all that.
Pete Young did Oliver with dogs.
I did, actually, I think The Spirit might have been one of my 3, but I suggested them doing a new wave fairy tale. It had like Cyndi Lauper as a Cinderella-esque character, and then a bag lady.
I remember that.
And there was like a bag lady was the fairy godmother. It was all taking fairy tale stuff and kind of turning it on its ear. And Ron had 3 ideas. He had or 5 ideas, I think. He had Trumpet of the Swan. He had Treasure Island in Space.
That's right.
He had Little Mermaid, and he had, what am I forgetting? I don't know. He had all those anyway. But I think since he only could do one, I think he pitched Little Mermaid. And
They said, no, we just did Splash.
Yeah, they said, well, they were going to do a sequel to Splash. That was the thing, because they were preparing a sequel to Splash. Didn't seem too much like that, so nah, forget it. But he did turn in. He had actually written a 2-page kind of outline-y treatment of it, which Jeffrey did read and actually sort of liked. And Michael Eisner, who was more versed in the ways of Disney, realized, hey, a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale sort of could make sense for Disney in just some high concept way. This is, and an underwater world. We should think about this more. So it went into development at that point, not with me attached, but with Ron, and it was sort of put under Roy Disney's thing. So Ron was really sort of working with Roy, but Roy was very skittish in a way, because I think Roy really was leery about changing the Anderson story, and Ron was like, no, we got to change the Anderson story, and Roy wasn't sure, and he was cautious about showing it to Jeffrey. Was very kind of defensive about it, but so there was development done where Doug Leffler and Bruce worked with Ron on visuals, and Michael Christopher, the live action guy, was supposed to write a script on it, and he never really did, and me having worked with Ron on Great Mouse Detective, where we kind of co-wrote and stuff, because even though we were directors, we were writing dialogue for sequences as well as stuff. Everybody, the story guys, did dialogue. So Ron asked me if I wanted to collaborate with him on a script, and I said, sure, I'd like to. So we went into Peter Schneider and said, hey, we're cheap. Michael Christopher's not doing anything. Let us try and write a script on him. It was Ron's original idea, and Peter said, okay, go ahead, do it. So we became sort of an official kind of team at that point, where we were collaborating on the script, and that was, I guess, I think we had some meetings on it in '85, and it was kind of written in '86, I think.
Yeah,
'86, yeah. So
I think that happened also.
So and then at one point, obviously, then they said with Howard Ashman, hey, and Howard's interested in this. We're interested in Howard. We told him about something he wants to work on. So Peter was like, go to New York and meet with Howard. It'll be great. He's got ideas. He's got a bunch of ideas on already. He wants to make the crab arrest a prey. Oh, you got to hear these ideas. So we're like, say what? Whatever. Because we had this treatment where there was a British sort of, court composer, stuffed shirt named Clarence, and like, he's going to be a Rasta man? He's going to be this laid-back, ganja-smoking guy? It's like, how can that jibe with our crowd? But then when we went to New York and we met with Howard...
So.
Yeah, well, he was like, I'm thinking Jeffrey Huller. I'm like, Jeffrey Huller? Okay. So, yeah, the Uncola man. We're very expansive and, very grand and all that. And then we're like, oh, okay, so he can be theatrical and grand and still be kind of a Jamaican guy. We get it. So then when we wrote the script, we had Jeffrey Huller in mind, yeah. Based on Howard's.
So was it easier to write with certain people?
Oh, absolutely,
in
yeah.
mind?
Even like the
I'm
witch.
going to do this.
The witch, we thought of as having a voice like B. Arthur, but character-wise, we thought of her kind of like Joan Collins. Howard had mentioned in Dynasty, how Joan Collins, this vamp, that
the witch
was like that. So when I wrote the dialogue for the witch, I would picture Joan Collins saying it in my head, kind of. And I think it is easier to write. Sometimes, obviously, you want to write for the character, but if there's an actor that you can picture playing the character, sometimes that can give you specific things. Also, Howard was big, which was true, and which we started doing. He was like, you got to say your dialogue out loud, which I think I hadn't done so much when I'd been writing dialogue before. So we would kind of read the dialogue aloud, or we'd speak it. And we had a table read of the script, and it was great just to hear the lines spoken, because it's different than when it's on the page.
Okay.
Yeah, then you see.
So when you and Ron are writing, I know that he does a draft, you do a draft, you bounce it back and forth. Do you guys speak the lines to each other?
We don't, actually, despite Howard's thing. We don't. That came a little later, even though Howard said that we hadn't done that on Mermaid. But then, since then, a little bit on Aladdin, and certainly on the subsequent films, we would... well, it's weird, because it's like we would still... I would say them to myself and sort of things like that. But then when we had this reading the script, we would have the dialogue aloud. And then all the rewrites after that, when we were working with other writers, when we get scenes... we would sit down, we'd all sit there, and we'd perform the scene. So we actually...
so at some point, first pass, maybe not, but
maybe,
after
that. I would say it tended to be that. First pass, not so much, but thereafter, yes. We would read them aloud, perform them with stage descriptions, do little sort of plays, and cast the different people around the table.
When you're doing a table read and you're listening to it, and do you go, I've got to rework that line?
We do, yeah. We did, yeah. We did. And although there were some times where, like on the first table read of Little Mermaid, the guy playing Skull was a white guy, and I can't remember his name. He was a comedian that Buck and Edelman, they were the casting people, they had found. And it was his idea. He said, and we said, yeah, he's this idiot seagull who doesn't, know what he's talking about. He said, well, I have an idea on how I want to do this. I was kind of thinking of doing him as Rochester from the Jack Benny Show. So we're like, if you want to, go ahead. So so the guy who's doing the Crab, who was an African American actor, and I don't remember his name, but he wasn't such a good actor. So the Crab was not coming off very well at all in the reading. And Scuttle was being done as Rochester. This is a dingle hopper. You use this to comb your hair. You know, it was like having Chris Rock practically do it, and it was hilarious. You know, perhaps politically incorrect, but hilarious nonetheless. So coming out of the reading, Peter Starr was like, "Well, obviously the seagull works great, and the Crab, he's nothing. He's nothing." Like, no, wait, that actor wasn't very good. You have to kind of interpret this a little bit. Don't just go with what was in the room. Kind of. So it was helpful, definitely, but with the grain of salt given the casting. So we did go back and made changes based on that, and there were notes that we were getting from Peter and other people. You know, we wrote a draft of the script. Actually, Jeffrey really liked our draft of the script, and that's when it really he was like, yeah, because he was like, they greenlit it based on our script, and then they said to us, okay, you guys, we want to contract you as directors. We had never been under a contract before. We were week-to-week employees, and suddenly they're like, you have to sign a 2-picture deal. We didn't have a lawyer. We didn't have an agent. We didn't have anything. So we found a lawyer.
Did you lawyer up for that?
We lawyered up, but with a guy who was a young, third-party, barely in an entertainment firm guy who got us, no deal, perhaps the best deal he could have made, which was no deal. So we directed Little Mermaid and wrote it and produced it for very, very, very little money, and in fact even signed on to an option for them to have us do another one after that for very little money, because first-time director, they'll,
Yeah, we're giving you your big break, so we're going to screw you.
Yeah, so we did that, and but then after Mermaid Count was a big success, then actually they wanted us to do Beauty and the Beast, which at that time was foundering a little bit. Dick Purdom was directing it, and they had a Linda Wolverton script, and it was not a musical, I think, and it was all. And Jeffrey, in the interest of cost savings as much as anything, said, "This script is golden. Do not change a word of Linda's script." And so they boarded her script word for word, and they put it all up on story reels. And he's like, "I hate this. What happened?" Sort of, and then so they had a big confab down in Florida, but Peter came to us. I think it's while we were doing the mix on Little Mermaid, and he took us to lunch at Musso and Frank's, and he's like, "I want you guys to do Beauty and the Beast," and we sort of listened on, and then after Peter left, Ron was just like, "I don't know about you, but I need a break." it was a stressful movie to do Little Mermaid.
Oh, yeah.
And he was just like, "I don't want to get back on the merry-go-round right now." I just couldn't do it. For me, I'm more neurotic, and I would have been,
You said, "Oh, okay."
Yeah, I was, in a way.
I worked straight through
Kinda
for
like,
30 years.
Yeah, basically. Like, I don't know if I turned down this job once before, and I wasn't sure what happened. So if they offer you something, you can't say no. But he was just like, so I just was like, okay, yeah, we're not doing it. So I thought, is this a good move or not? But we're not doing it. But we did take a meeting or two on it. But then we had an idea of a movie we wanted to do after that, actually, that we inquired about getting the rights to, that Charlie Fink was in charge of development at that time. And it was a book called We're Back. And it was dinosaurs.
Oh, really?
And we wanted to make that. And we thought, hey, this could be kind of a neat thing. This is sort of like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs with a 70-year-old Snow White and dinosaurs instead of the dwarfs. So we thought it could be really fun.
And it was made later.
Well, even at that time, and then Charlie Fink comes back to us, the rights are tied up to that. And we go, the rights? Really? I mean, it's just a children's book. Nobody even knows about this book. He's like, guess what? Spielberg has the rights.
Oh,
it's his kid's favorite book. Like, you're kidding me. Of all the books, of all the gin joints in all the world, Spielberg's kid has to read this one. So we had to do something else. So they said, here, we have 3 ideas that you might be interested in. One of them is Swan Lake, doing that as a musical. The other was this thing about lions in Africa called King of the Jungle. And we thought, who's going to go see a movie about lions in Africa? What idiot would want to go see? And then the third one was Aladdin, which Howard Ashman had pitched to the studio before then. It had been going before we ever got on it. Howard had written a treatment, had written songs. They had developed a script based on his treatment. They didn't like that script. They were monkeying around. They threw out the songs. They hired Linda, was going through all this. But we read the stuff. We liked Howard's stuff, actually. And we said, yeah, we'd like to do Aladdin. And so he said, okay, you're on Aladdin. So then we, having read all that stuff.
So how big a break between...
very little. I mean, it was... 3
or 4 months later, you were boom on that?
Well, the one weird thing was that was in a period... There was a contractual thing because in the meantime, we changed lawyers. So now, Maureen Donnelly, who was our associate producer and now had moved into a development executive, a creative executive, she told us, she's like, I've got Melanie Cook as my lawyer. She's Tim Burton's lawyer. She's like, you guys should talk to Melanie Cook. I'm like, Melanie Cook, really? Would she talk to us? And Melanie said, sure, yeah. So she talked to us, and she hired us on. So we became Melanie's.
And she got you a better deal.
A much better deal. So as it was, so they were. And she said to them, like, hey, this deal is terrible. Come on, get real. This is you paid them nothing for that. You're going to pay them nothing for this. No. And so then they said, okay, we'll rip up the deal, but we'll want another movie
beyond that.
Yeah, and so we said, okay, but we were kind of miles apart with what we wanted. What we wanted and what they wanted to pass were miles apart, such that I heard Charlie Fink, I think, told us, or somebody, Jeffrey said when he got the response from Melanie, he was like, I've seen this happen before. These people have, success. It goes to their head. Move on. It's not going to happen. So as we sort of, Jeffrey had his offer, and we said, this is our offer. And then Jeffrey, in effect, kind of walked away. He was just like, okay, forget it. And so for a while, we were sitting in rooms reading magazines because we couldn't, we were like, we were not doing anything.
No assignments.
No assignments.
But you were still on salary.
We were in Siberia. We were on salary, but it was like, who knows what's going to happen. But we really like, hey, we'll talk. We'll talk. We were like, we're not crazy. Wait. We didn't really mean that. So I think Melanie came back to them and made a counteroffer that was not what they were offering, but at least such that the conversation got reopened again. So then they managed to work out a deal, which was much better than the Mermaid deal, much better than we would have had
without her.
But not what I think what we had asked for necessarily. I think we just wanted a one picture thing.
You
we
met
didn't
in the
want
middle.
two picture things. We met in the middle somewhere, and which was fine. And so that we had the period of reading magazines for a few weeks in the Royce building, or not in the Royce, in the one down the street where the ARL was, down on Chastain or whatever. But then we were sort of right back into it, so we really didn't have much of a break at all, because Mermaid essentially took 3 years. It was begun in kind of 86 and was released in 89, and we started on Aladdin
in 90?
90, yeah, early 90, and then it came out in 92, so there was really a quick turnaround on Aladdin. And Howard was sick at that point because, we discovered that he was HIV positive.
So, yeah. You wrote some very good...
I wrote about that on his sister Sarah Ashman.
Which we will be linking to.
Well, Sarah's blog. It's a very good blog about Howard Ashman, if anybody's a fan of Howard. It's got a lot of neat behind-the-scenes pictures and anecdotes of people that worked with Howard. And I've been doing some things lately about my experiences with Howard. But so once again, we were working with Howard, but he was ill, so he didn't travel as much, so he was really in New York, and we would go to meet with him a few times while he was working on it, but his health was declining sharply at that point. He was finishing up Beauty and the Beast, really. That, when we began with him on Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast had not come out, and that was really, it was a year and a half before he died. He really, once he got really sick, he
stayed close to home.
Stayed close to home. He couldn't travel, yeah,
So, but he did a pretty handful of songs for that.
He did. Well, he had done an original set of songs for the movie when he was pitching it. And when we developed the story, some of the songs didn't work anymore. So he had a whole set of friends that we didn't wind up using, so their song kind of went out the window. They had two songs, and those went out the window kind of. And then there was a great song that Howard wrote called Proud of Your Boy, where Aladdin had a mother. And then when we showed Jeffrey the reels in the fall of in the spring, around this time in '91, he shot it down, and he was like, "Mom, she's a 0, 86 the mom." And we're like, "Wait a second!" But he sings this great song, "Proud of Your Boy," to his mom. I don't care. She's nothing. Get rid of her. So that song, so that song kind of went away. He became an orphan. He became kind of older. In effect, he went from being Michael J. Fox to Tom Cruise, sort of. And,
he sort of looks like Tom Cruise.
That was. Jeffrey gave us that line. It was great. I think it may have even been on Mermaid, because I think he wanted us to audition Tom Cruise to be a voice, and he told me, "Gentlemen, I am telling you, if it were the Middle Ages, Tom Cruise would be a prince." Okay. Like, really? Okay. Just like Jeffrey said,
we
guys.
had no idea.
Yeah, did the same thing with Mermaid. So when we were showing the first color test on the Mermaid, and she was red-haired, he's like, "What?" And then like, "Yeah, she's a red. She's fiery. It's her personality." Like, guys, everybody knows mermaids are blonde. Which he knew from Splash or something. It's like it's the fact of nature, it's science or whatever. And like,
That's right.
No, and we won that argument. We didn't win a ton of arguments with Jeffrey, but we won that one because
her hair is red.
It's red, and I think Peter did run interference with it, sort of like Jeffrey. Fight with him on this or that. This one They're not, it's going to be a nightmare. So Jeffrey picked his battles, as did we. So he was willing to concede on Hercules.
Well, there were a lot of tug of wars in Aladdin, redoing the middle of the picture and redoing the front.
Well, and certainly even on Little Mermaid, where Jeffrey wanted to cut part of your world, which is sort of like our Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Like, Jeffrey, you can't cut it. And he's like, no, the kids were squirming, it's got to go. And we tried to talk him, and he wouldn't listen to us. And Howard sort of half-heartedly tried to talk to him. He wouldn't listen to Howard, but Glenn was the guy, Glenn Keane, actually, like, Jeffrey, you cannot do this. So Jeffrey gave us a reprieve. Okay, you can leave it in for a preview, and we'll see how it goes.
And it went okay in the preview.
It went okay in the preview. Where it hadn't gone well was earlier. We had an in-house screening where Tom Schumacher, in his kind of Gene Wilder fashion, hey, kids, where he was working for the Center Theater Group or something like that, and he would bring kids to the theater and do a talk about the theater and sort of do a Q&A, and he was kind of, Oprah Winfrey or Mr. Rogers, whatever he was. But so there was a bunch of kids that were brought in to see Little Mermaid, and hey, kids, everybody having a good time, that sort of kind of thing. But unfortunately, during that song, they were squirming and popcorn was flying around a little bit. So that's when Judge was like, "Now you got to cut it out." But then he let us, when we had a real preview in the theater with, again, people didn't pay money, but they were seeing it on a big screen, and it was adults and kids and all that. And it was further along. It was animated. It wasn't just storyboard drawings and all that. And it held its own, and they didn't squirm. So it stayed. And
so it stayed in the picture.
Stayed in the picture.
So Aladdin, of all the pictures you've done, that was the last one you did with Jeffrey, right? Because he was gone.
Right. Jeffrey left in 94. We started in development on Hercules. We had done a little bit of work on Hercules with Jeffrey. We got a list of ideas. I can't remember if, we had something else in mind. I don't even remember. But I think they showed us a list of things. And again, the one we liked on that list was Hercules. And Jeffrey's like, fine, have at it, go to it. Joe Hadar had pitched it at a Gong show. And it had been, a little had been done, but not very much at all. And we just sort of picked that. And Jeffrey said, yeah, go to it. So we started developing that. And I think we wrote a treatment that Jeffrey gave us notes on. Ugh, I hate this. Those kind of notes. And, I'm forgetting the obvious thing. That's yes, Ron would shoot me. The big thing at that time was Treasure Planet. We spent between after Aladdin, we wanted to do Treasure Planet, and Jeffrey
kept shooting it down.
Well, right? Jeffrey initially was like, well, maybe, and so we were in development on it, but he didn't like anything we were doing. He just didn't like the idea of it. He didn't like a kid protagonist. He just didn't respond to the science fiction. You name it, he didn't like about it. So we kept trying to push it, and then we got finally, I think, a meeting with Michael, and we showed him with Jeffrey what we were doing. Jeffrey at least allowed us to do that. So what ultimately came out of that was they said, okay, you got to do Hercules first, but you can do that as your next movie after Hercules. So they sort of agreed to that.
Oh, okay.
So, but Jeffrey still didn't, all the time he was doing it, he didn't like it. He never liked it. He kept trying to turn into other things. At one point, that's when we had the great classic meeting. That was the one in France. That was when we were doing the Aladdin press junket, and we were in development on Treasure Planet, and other things were going on in development. Pocahontas, Mulan, bunch of things.
Probably Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Hunchback, same thing. And so we're at a table having a nice lunch in Paris with all these foreign journalists. We're at the park at the time. The junket was in Euro Disney, trying to get that going. And we had a lunch, and Jeffrey was at the lunch, and he was kind of holding court, and he was just saying, I think we got a great lineup coming. I'm so excited about all these projects. You got Mulan, it's fantastic, and you got your and at that point, Lion King had come up. We talked about Lion King a little bit, and he said, and you got Hunchback, whatever, and you got Pocahontas. They're all good. He never mentioned Treasure Planet whatsoever. So Ron and I looked at each other after lunch, and we said, do we still have a job at the studio? Because he rattled off.
He skipped right over that.
He rattled off everyone, and he didn't do that one. So
like
we said we got
we
got to have a meeting with Jeffrey, and I think we had already had a past meeting maybe where we had pitched him an idea because we were trying to get going somehow. So it was turning Treasure Island somehow, or Treasure Planet had turned into I don't know if it was King Solomon's Mines in space or something like that, but it was or the African Queen in space, I think. Maybe it had mutated into that in a little treatment that we had written and pitched to Jeffrey. So when we got together with Jeffrey, Jeffrey was like, talked to us, notes about, I don't know. So we had dinner with Jeffrey. We had dinner in the New York Steakhouse at Euro Disney. All the foreign journalists are there. It's in the evening, during that junket. And John Locke, come here. Here. I have to walk around characters, do stuff with these people. You got to come on, get the thing. Yes, of course, Jeffrey, Jean-Luc, who is John Locke to Jeffrey. So Jean-Luc gets the characters, but the Euro Disney characters at that time were like Cirque du Soleil characters. They were like, people like mimes on stilts and things like that. So anyway, so Ron, so I'm sitting at this table. So Jeffrey's there, and Ron's there, and I'm across from Ron, and Jeffrey's over there, and we're getting into this huge argument, where Jeffrey says at one point, he's like, okay, Jeffrey, because he's, that didn't work, your science fiction version. What if you take a story like Romeo and Juliet, make it Romeo and Juliet, and Ron just went, Jeffrey, every single movie doesn't have to be Romeo and Juliet, okay? You're doing Pocahontas, that's Romeo and Juliet. You're doing Mulan, that's Romeo and Juliet. And he's like, you're doing Lion King, and he's like, I wouldn't want to do that movie anyway. And Jeffrey's like, you're not doing that movie or something. and he's like, Jeffrey, you got a female protagonist, you got this, characters like the genie we had in line. Those movies have no room for those kind of characters. Those are the movies, and you're making one after another. And then at that point, Jeffrey got a phone call. And he went off to the kitchen to take his phone call. And he came back to the table. Okay, you kind of tagged me there, all right? You got one in on me, all right? And so you think too many of these movies are the same? And I was like, yeah, they're all kind of following the same template. And that's, I think, when we got the reprieve to, okay, you can rework it, show it to Michael Eisner and see what he thinks. But in the meantime, then he went back to Tom Schumacher, who was head of development. Tom, too many of these movies are the same. So forever after, if not before, Tom, where did you hear this from, Jeffrey? The red guy, the guy, the shorter of the two of those guys, because he never knew who was who. He didn't know my name. Yeah, I have my.
You told me that.
I know he never knew my name. It was funny. Many occasions to this day he doesn't know who I am. But so I think he sort of read Tom a riot act of sorts, such that Tom forever after has been, he and Ron have been very didn't mix well. I would say have not mixed well and have clashed. And so Tom was not a happy camper. That Jeffrey was saying, you got to put more things in the mix, and let's not have everyone with a female protagonist, and let's not have them all be Romeo and Juliet, let's not and they don't have to be this and that. So anyway, so we got a reprieve to do Treasure Planet, but it still was like, do it later, so we wound up working on Hercules, and which we enjoyed, and was fun, and that was a crazy thing, because then Jeffrey left, and then it was like with Peter, he was like, Jeffrey's gone, have at it, sort of. So even stylistically, like, we were able to bring in Gerald Scarfe to do drawings that we wouldn't have been able to do with Jeffrey, because Peter was like, yeah, make it look like that, sort of like he was like Joe Hale was on Black Collar, almost like, don't have everything look the same. Give it a different look, the Disney house style. Forget all that stuff. Do something.
Back to forget about the Disney house style.
It was really, and Peter was like that, and
well, you did deviate quite a bit.
We
from
did.
The Disney
Well,
house style.
we again, and actually it was Rick Mackey who suggested Gerald Scarfe, and said, why don't you guys have Gerald Scarfe do some drawings of this? And I was a huge fan of Gerald Scarfe growing up, seeing his work, and so we approached him, and he wanted to do it. So it was a very great, fun relationship where we went to England and we pitched him the story. He came out and we went there, and he worked through the mail and came out and talked to the animators, and we did symposiums with them, and Gerald showed some of his drawings and drew over theirs, and it was very collaborative. So
how do you and Ron, since we don't want to be here till tomorrow,
and in fact, I'm probably going to have to go back shortly. So yes.
How do you and Ron divvy up the work? You both collaborate on the script.
We do, although nowadays that's a slightly sore subject, because in the most modern era, they're like, you should work with the writer right from the get-go. I think they don't trust our story instincts, or maybe story, but not script writing. So on this current project we're doing, we're working with a very talented writer at the moment. I don't know who the final writer will be if the project even gets made, but on most of those films, yes, we would write the first draft, and we have a style where we would kind of hammer out a treatment or an outline together, and then I would go off and write first, and I would kind of improvise on paper, and I would write dialogue, and I would, based on that outline, and I would write, the same scene 12 different times, and I would just be like improvising on paper, not censoring myself, not editing, not worrying exactly how it's going to fit together, letting it all out there like an improv thing transcribed. And then Ron would take all those pages, and he would sift through them, and he would find things he liked, and sometimes I might have written it 10 times and he didn't like any of them, and he'd write his own thing, or he'd take a piece from version A and a piece from version C and grafting together with his own material. All the time he's doing this, I don't see anything until he's done, unless he wants to make a change in the outline or I did. If I had a change where I said, I think we're in a corner here that we have to get out of, but generally, so I would spend like, say, 8 weeks doing this, feeding him pages. So I would have 500 pages of script, handwritten again. My mother, God love her, still couldn't type, so I couldn't type, so I would handwrite all the stuff. You can read my writing, as terrible as it is. And then he said, I don't want, you're going to throw me if we're comparing notes during this. So he wouldn't show me anything until he had a script.
He had a total script.
He had made choices. He had, and he had a script of relatively reasonable length. They're always long, but they were still in the neighborhood. So then I would read the script, and I would read it pretty fresh because literally, the stuff I'd written 8 weeks ago, I'd written 10 different ways, and I didn't know which way one he used, and I couldn't even remember reading it. Such that
some of it he used, and then he'd go a different way.
Yeah, and sometimes I'd say, why didn't you use my stuff for this part? He said, that is your stuff. I'm like, really? And I'd go back, because I would never reread what I had written initially, or rarely would I do that. So anyway, I would rewrite over his stuff, and then he would, so we'd go back and forth a little bit then, and then we'd turn in a rough draft to whoever the development
now, how many
at that time.
pictures did you do where that was the process?
We did that
All
on
of them?
Mermaid, we did that on Aladdin, we did that on Hercules, we did that on Treasure Planet. And in fact, although I think Ted and Terry, that was one where we were so burned out from Hercules, and Ted and Terry really wanted to do a script on that we had worked with on Aladdin. They actually wrote a script on Treasure Planet before we had a chance to do that, which with our biorhythms was not a good thing in a way almost, because they did some things that were neat but weren't what we would do. So we came into that one, I was feeling like, we didn't have a clear slate to do our own thing. And then on Princess and the Frog, same deal. We wrote a treatment, and then we brought in writers. As we moved into production, we got busier, and to get another voice in the room and to fix things. Certainly on the case of Aladdin, on Mermaid, we sort of did that. Howard did a little bit of rewriting on Mermaid, some really essential rewriting, and they brought in some guys to punch up Buddy Hackett's dialogue. Graham and Hummel, I can't remember their name, but they were sort of like an actor, Garrett Graham, I think his name is. They rewrote his dialogue because we recast Scuttle. It was a different actor, and Jeffrey's like, get a comedian. That's what we did on Oliver. We got Richard Mulligan. Half your battle is won. If you can't make the funny guy, he's supposed to be funny, cast a comedian, and you're halfway there.
Buddy Hackett.
So we picked Buddy Hackett, and then we wrote for Buddy Hackett, and these writers that were writing wrote even more so to Buddy Hackett. Buddy Hackett, of course, was mad when he read the script. He was like, write for the character, don't write for me. And when Buddy Hackett first came in to do Scuttle, he wasn't doing it as Buddy Hackett, he was doing a character. And in so many words, we're like, Buddy, it's you. You are the character. What?
We want it to be you.
Yeah, you. So finally he did him, and we were very happy. But I would say, that's been the system that we've used, except for those exceptions that I mentioned. But it's been good, and we've worked with a lot of talented writers, Bob Edwards, Irene Mackey, and Don Shaw, Bob McEnery, and Ted and Terry Rossio, who've gone on to great things with Pirates of the Caribbean. And now the Lone Ranger. They sort of, dreamed of an re-envisioning of that at least was the basis for getting it going. I don't know if they're still involved or not, but
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I thought there was just one of them doing that, but maybe they were both of them. I think they were.
I don't know if they split up. I don't know. Yeah, but it's been fun working with those other writers, and they've brought things to it that we wouldn't, and it's been good. Yeah.
So you think you're going to continue doing the first draft if possible yourself?
If it were left to me, I would rather do that. Right now, we're developing this thing where we're collaborating on kind of a story, and we may not do the first draft on this one, and it'll be interesting to see how it comes. Maybe we'll be more objective about it. It'll be something different, and I'm game to try it, but I feel a little, it's like, because I know, like in the studio, even like Ed Count and those guys, like Brad Bird, he can write the first draft. Andrew Stanton can write the first draft, but you guys, no, you can't write the first draft. So I'm like, well, come on. Hey, we've written some things. I can put a sentence together. I know punctuation. But I understand what they're saying. But
so I'm going to wrap up.
Yes. I'm sorry, American public, and the 10 people that actually watch this podcast, but yeah, okay.
And the 15 overseas.
Yes, and the 15.
But here's my question. Of all the pictures you've done, do you have a favorite, two favorites, three favorites, or is it like trying to tell your children?
It is exactly.
You're the one I like the best. You're not so much.
Yeah, you can stay out in the art for a while. It is exactly like that. So I like them. I like them all, and I don't pick favorites, but there are things about each one that I would say I take away. Certainly, working on Little Mermaid with the music of Howard and Alan, of all the musicals we've done, in some ways that was, you could say, for us even maybe the most exciting, because we being introduced to this world of sort of musical comedy theater, which we were fans of, which I've seen many plays, and I still go to the theater and I love all that and love the classic composers for the stage, whether or not it's Rodgers and Hammerstein or Stephen Sondheim or whatever. And I like musicals. I'm heterosexual, but I like musicals. Don't ask me what happened there. But so like for example that, and then on Aladdin, certainly getting to work with Rob and getting to work with Eric Goldberg, there was a real stimulus with that, and all of them, the different story teams. Each movie has been a different. Some people have carried over from movie to movie, but it hasn't been exactly the same team, and it's really working with those artists and sort of solving the different problems of those movies, the different milieus of them. So getting to work with Gerald Scarfe on Hercules was really sort of fun, and the challenges involved in that, and Princess and the Frog, working with Rob Edwards, the writer, on that, and getting a chance, and working with John Lasseter more than anybody, because had John not come along, hand-drawn animation would have been completely gone. It faces an uncertain future right now. It's not clear. Is it going to continue? Will it be a hybrid? Will it turn into something? The jury is out right now, but it would not have been done at all had John not come back to Disney and lobbied for it. And he loves hand-drawn, and I give John all the props in the world that he was willing to take it on the line to really keep hand-drawn animation going because of his love of the art form. So and John, it's been great. I went to school with John. I went shopping in Alpha Beta with John. I played frisbee in the main gallery at the Arts with John. I did laundry with John. No, he did laundry at home at Whittier College, or Whittier, where he grew up. But he's been a really good boss to work for. He's great story sense, very collaborative, and it's really been fun working with John. So every movie, I would say, has had some downtimes, and it's had more positives than negatives. Even the ones in hindsight that were tough, I actually, despite my bitching and moaning on this thing, I remember having fun, and overall, it's been a great ride. I mean, I have no complaints whatsoever.
Which one, in retrespect, at the time you were doing it, seemed the toughest, or do they all seem tough?
Well, they all do seem tough. I would say honestly, it was very stressful working for Jeffrey. So certainly, Mermaid and Aladdin were really hard. I would say the one thing is like during the tough times on Aladdin, when it seemed like Jeffrey was saying, "You guys have no idea what you're doing," I always felt like, we just did Little Mermaid. Come on, we know something. So those barbs were less devastating or whatever than they were on Mermaid, say, where you're not sure how's it going to turn out, but that gave us something going into the next one. I would say during the making of it, Treasure Planet was the toughest in some ways, because 2D, that was while we were making that, they decided we're not going to do 2D anymore, so there was that cloud over the movie. Tom Schumacher really didn't like the movie, never really wanted to make the movie, so you're making a movie for somebody who has no belief in the movie. So his notes often would be, do anything but this, sort of. I mean, and so you could say, and in hindsight, obviously, I don't know, maybe he was right. Maybe we didn't click to the fact that this wasn't going to resonate with the American public. It didn't resonate with Tom at all. So, but as a consequence, his notes weren't additives so much, it seemed like, on that movie. At least I don't recall them so much. And he tried, I guess, but it wasn't his cup of tea. So I'd say that was the toughest. But certainly there was a period where we didn't get a movie made after Treasure Planet, and that may have been the toughest of all, where we're in this regime where Michael Eisner didn't trust us, didn't like any of the ideas we were pitching, trying to get something going, we're jumping from project to project. We were like persona non gratas at the studio. David Staten really thought we were dinosaurs and was just as happy to see us leave. Those were not the happiest of times.
No,
I would say.
I can't imagine.
No, that was unpleasant. And then coming back with John, though, it was absolutely night and day, because John was supportive. John spoke the same language. John's a filmmaker. John's an artist. He's not a suit, and he thought we had something to offer, and so that's just night and day. So that was it was lots of fun working with John. Even though we disagreed on some things, but it was very collaborative, and I'm very grateful that he gave us the opportunity.
Well, thank you.
So there you go.